Tavistock Gender Clinic, it's arguably the biggest medical scandal of our times, and it's going to become more and more so.
We don't allow children to drink, we don't allow them to use sunbeds, and yet we're giving, 9, 10 years old, the same drugs that are used to chemically castrate sex offenders.
There were clinicians at the Tavistock who did not want to be doing what they were doing. Children were being really harmed by this, and parents queuing up to transition their children. How could this have possibly be happening in plain sight of everybody?
This is a massive social experiment on this generation of children. We don't know what the psychological effects will be.
This is the issue of our time. Its impacts on each and every one of us. I'm not okay with this ideology. I'm not okay with children being irreversibly damaged, and there is nothing wrong with me saying that.
Now, in recent years, there's been a huge increase in the number of children reporting gender dysphoria.
Well, it's estimated that around 48 children a week are now being referred to the Tavistock and Portman Trust, which is the NHS's first transgender clinic specifically for children.
The clinics here and in London see 3,000% more patients than they did 10 years ago. Among girls, referrals are up more than 5,000%.
Children who have presented themselves to this Tavistock have increased and increased and increased and increased over the past number of years. And the change has happened that it's predominantly girls now rather than the small number of boys that it used to be, even just 10 or 15 years ago. So clearly something is happening within the culture.
What's happened more recently, in the recent decades, has been a couple of huge shifts in the phenomena. First of all, is just the massive increase in the numbers. It used to be that the estimates were like 1 in 50,000 people were transsexual, and now Stonewall says that 1% of the population is transgender, so that is a huge increase. I'm Michael Biggs, and I'm a sociologist at the University of Oxford. When you look at the demand, if you look at the people going to gender clinics on the NHS, they have increased over the last 50 years 200-fold, by a factor of 200. So the medicalisation of what we might call gender nonconformity has increased again massively. I mean, there's no other kind of medical phenomena that is increased by that magnitude.
I feel like the reason why we're getting so many new gender dysphoria cases and this huge upsurge in gender affirmation is there's a lot of money in this.
Richie's interview, take 1.
My name is Richie. I am 35 years old and I am detransitioning after spending nearly a decade as a trans woman. When I was very little, I was quite boisterous. I was very much in a dress-up. Play for me didn't really have any boundaries, and I had a lot of charisma. As I got older, it kind of just felt like that faded away. But when I was very little, I was like a bright shining light, you know? I was really happy. And it was just as I got older that things started to change. When I was around 6 or 7 years old, I realised that I was kind of aging out of that period where gendered play was okay for a little kid. Like, I was playing with public kitchens, I wanted to be a ballerina. And to that point, it was like really like, you know, that's cute, but they're just little, whatever. But when I got to about the age of 7 or 8, I still wanted to be a ballerina. And I knew I shouldn't want anything feminine like that. And that put the fear into me, like I was different, like an alien amongst my peers. I knew that difference was actually a weakness, and it was my personal responsibility to stop that weakness from transpiring.
When I was a kid, like I always say 3, it's certainly as far back as I go
in my mind. I'm 47 now, so that's a long way. And when I was about 3, I thought I should be a boy. It was quite obvious to me that I should be a boy. Looking back, I get it. I completely get it. I think, yeah, I can see where I looked around and said, no, I should be with the boys here. I presented very male for many years. And the big questions people get asked to be diagnosed, children get asked to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria is, are they insistent, persistent and consistent? Well, I certainly was. For many, many years, I was insistent, persistent and consistent that I was a boy. And everybody let me be. You know, this was Dublin, you know, 70s and 80s. And so they just let me be that strange little kid. And so I was. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm based in Ireland, and I work in a lot of different contexts around gender, with families, with various detransitioners, a lot of detransitioners. I'm an author as well, so I write about gender quite a lot. There's a freedom pre the diagnosis kind of world that we live in now. There was a freedom to kind of do things without being labelled and stamped and categorised and made a policy of, if you follow me. So no policy was made of me. So off I went in my life. As far as I was concerned, I was a better boy than anybody I knew. I was, you know, able to fight them and better at football and faster than them and climbed higher trees, etc. And I didn't want anything to do with being feminine. Looking back, I was a complete inner misogynist. I thought girls were really annoying, and I thought tomboys were these ridiculous girly boys who were trying to be boys and really didn't know what they were doing, because I was the real McCoy. In my mind, that's how I thought. So if I had known the word trans kid, I would have said, oh yeah, that's obviously me. Where do I go? When I went through puberty, it was very difficult, because I realised, it was a reckoning for me, because I realised it's magical thinking that I was engaged in really as a kid. And now I've come to consciousness, because I'm a little bit older, I'm mortified and I'm in a corner here and I can't get out. How the hell do I back out of this? And the most strongest thing was nature's bigger than me. My body was changing and no brain, I thought I could basically intimidate everybody down, that my force of personality would be enough to shape my world. I now know, because I know psychology, that's magical thinking. God bless my arrogance, like that I actually thought this could happen, but I thought it could happen, and puberty made me realise, oh my God, nature's so much bigger than you. And so when I first heard the concept of puberty blockers, I was walking on the street and I stopped and I said, oh no, oh that couldn't be. Having had my experience, that would be so bad for me. Now it's completely biased, obviously, because I had my experience, but sometimes we get a richer understanding when you speak to somebody who's had an experience.
Gender clinics around the world use puberty-blocking drugs to stop the development of secondary sex characteristics, so periods, breasts, Adam's apples and breaking voices. These blockers work on the brain to stop the eventual release of estrogen and testosterone, the sex hormones that increase during puberty.
Use of these drugs on children at the time of natural puberty. The experiment has been done on children and now we're doing it on animals. I'm Stephanie Davis-Sarai and I founded Transgender Trend in 2015 to call for evidence-based healthcare for children with gender dysphoria and for science-based teaching in schools. It's very, very difficult to go back once you've started on the medical pathway. And we know that the effects of puberty blockers, well, they used to be presented as a way that children can buy time, a pause button, as if you can stop puberty and then resume it in a year or two and there'd be no effects. I mean, that's crazy. The surge of sex hormones at puberty are necessary for that really critical, probably the most important period of development in your life. You're changing from a child into an adult. And those sex hormones are not just for the development of secondary sex characteristics, they're for bones, blood, brain, organs, skin, every part of your body. And, you know, the cognitive development, there's ongoing trials on sheep at the moment that's showing harmful effects, particularly in spatial awareness. These trials were being done on animals now, but essentially we've been doing the trials on children first. And these children will have to live with these effects forever.
Younger and younger children are being started on puberty blockers because parents are being told, well, it will make the transitioning journey easier for them. So we're forcing parents and children to make these decisions at younger ages. My name's James Esses, I'm the co-founder of Thoughtful Therapists, and I'm currently taking my university to court for discrimination against my beliefs. If a child starts puberty blockers before they've actually commenced puberty, and then they progress directly onto cross-sex hormones, that young child can be left infertile. That young child can never reach sexual maturity. You know, puberty blocker, there's not a huge amount of long-term research on this, but what is available is showing potential damage to bone development and even to brain development as well. And cross-sex hormones can bring about, you know, many irreversible changes, whether it's hair growth or vocal changes. And equally, the type of hormones that are being used can cause kind of long-standing bone-related and growth-related problems as well. So for those individuals out there who say that transitioning is reversible, that is a complete and utter lie. And then, of course, we get on to the potential surgical interventions, you know, which are the worst of all, really. And there's these young people losing a part of themselves and a part of their bodies that they can never get back again.
So when I was at the clinic, the lowest age was 16 for puberty blockers. That, in their programme of research, lowered down, and I learned that there were children of 10, 11, 12 being given the option to have their puberty blocked. I'm Susan Evans and I work as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist in private practice. So I first came across gender identity work because I had a post at the Tavistock Clinic in the adult department doing psychotherapy and training there. But a small part-time post came up for a clinical nurse specialist within the gender identity service. It was called the Gender Identity Development Service at that time, GIDS, I'll call it from now on in. But it was just a post to what I thought meet, assess and treat psychotherapeutically the young children who were being referred to the clinic with gender dysphoria or gender identity issues. When I went to the GIDS, it struck me that something different was beginning to go on. Now, it wasn't massively in place at that time, but I did witness it. Children on their research programme, 98% of them who started puberty blockers went on to cross-sex hormones. So you've set something in train that, although it's talked about as being a pause for thought or being reversible in the first stage, you know, it clearly isn't. And I would argue that even just telling a child, yes, I agree there's something wrong with your body, and therefore we are going to give you a drug that will block your body developing, I think that in itself is an irreversible step.
The concern that I have is about the medicalisation of children. You know, for adults, often adults make bad choices, and I mean, obviously we don't want that to happen, but you know, adults they can smoke, even though we know smoking might you know, will definitely have bad health effects. But you know, we say adults can make a choice. But with children, it's different. We don't allow children to drink. We don't allow children to smoke. We don't allow them to use sunbeds because that's too dangerous for them. And yet we're giving, you know, 9 years old, at least a few of them are these kind of the same drugs that are used to chemically castrate sex offenders.
So you're consigning them to a life without sexual pleasure. You're consigning them to a life where they won't become a parent. You're consigning them to be medical patients forever. Big Pharma is hugely implicated in this. We have this idea as people that the pharmaceutical industry is there to help us. But also it is a capitalist industry, it makes money. The pharmaceutical industry is hugely invested in the transitioning of children.
Puberty blockers essentially shut down the production of sex hormones. So they are, chemically castrating a male and the equivalent for a female. There are a number of physical changes. For example, bone density does not increase the way it should, and that might lead to osteoporosis. But what's even more disturbing are the things we don't know about. So we don't know about emotional and cognitive development. And one thing that is not being really addressed is the capacity to develop sexually, that you will never develop the capacity to orgasm. So that's something that is a huge step, if you like, for a 10-year-old to if you like, not even be told, but in effect be signing away their ability to ever have an orgasm.
Children, in my view, really cannot understand that if they consent to puberty blocking and put themselves on a pathway to cross-sex hormones, that they are giving away a life in a sense that they can't envisage.
So when I first looked into this, I was reading, I think some feminists were on Twitter, and they said that the puberty blockers were the same drugs that were given, Lupron, which is given to castrate sex offenders. And I thought they must be wrong. Obviously that's ludicrous, it could never happen. And so I thought they must have got the drug confused. And then I looked into it and I discovered it was, the drug Lupron is the same drug. That's the brand that's used in America. It's a different brand in Britain, but it's the same basic drug, gonadotropin releasing hormone agonist. And I thought, but they must obviously give the kids much smaller doses. So it must be the dosage must be very different. And then of course the dosage is identical. Because of course the function in both cases is the same. You want to shut down the sex hormones. I became very interested then as what is the evidence for this, because it seems to me that there must be compelling evidence that this treatment is effective. And I looked into a study that was done, announced by the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust, the Gender Identity Clinic, which is the clinic that is for all children with gender dysphoria in Britain apart from Scotland. So England, Wales and Northern Ireland. They announced a study in 2011 of giving children these drugs, and I emailed them because this was maybe 2018. So they'd started the study in 2010, and I said, so what happened with that study? And they never bothered to respond to me. And then I began to digging and discovered some preliminary results that were buried in a document that they gave to the NHS Foundation Trust Board, which suggested that actually the results were negative. The kids didn't improve, and in some cases they became more depressed, or even suicidality increased. And I discovered there were some conference papers that I dug up, just the abstracts, and they said again that the expected improvement we did not see. And so really it was thanks to my efforts and through Transgender Trend, Stephanie Davis-Arai, working very closely with her, that we managed through a press campaign, through BBC Newsnight, through questions in Parliament, being asked in Parliament, and also complaints to the Health Research Authority, that finally we managed to get them to release the study, which showed that there was no improvement.
Newsnight has learnt that data suggesting that self-harm increased after young people started a controversial medical treatment. Michael Biggs is an Oxford University sociologist who has raised concerns about this area, attracting criticism from some in the transgender community for his views. He gave Newsnight a series of documents relating to the research study he'd obtained via Freedom of Information requests, including something called a protocol.
So here's the protocol. It guides the conduct and the design of the study, how many people it will recruit,
how long it will last, and what outcomes it's measuring. It also pulls together what is already known from the scientific literature.
We've had these documents independently looked at. Experts Newsnight has consulted are critical about how the study was set up.
Newsnight can reveal that potentially significant scientific data were missing from both the protocol and the participant information sheet.
When I had the appointment where I was identifying now as a trans man, I had decided to go on hormones potentially for life, which is quite typical with a binary transition. I knew that I wanted a double mastectomy, but by that point, I believed I wanted hormones as well. It was very frightening because obviously what these people were going through were quite major and I could see permanent changes, but I'd never felt comfortable in my identity and in my body since I'd started puberty. So for me, it felt like there was no other option. It felt like this was clearly going to be the only way to fix the problem that I had as I saw it. My name's Amber. I'm a detransitioner, which means that I went through a gender transition medically and I detransitioned, so I live now as my birth sex. I think for me it really started at puberty, because at puberty I started to have a different way of referring to the world. I think the world saw me very differently. When I was a child I felt very free to be exactly who I was, and gender didn't come into it at all. It didn't really feature in anything I had to think or say. But when I hit puberty, that changed with the social world around me, the way peers referred to me, but also the way adults referred to me. I unfortunately was experiencing some sexualization from adults. It was something that really affected the way I felt about my body. It tied in with my puberty to make me feel that what I was going through was ruining my life and making me into something I never wanted to be. I think for me, a lot of it was influenced as well by my sexuality. So I really struggled to figure out how I identified sexually and how I wanted to intimately be with other people. I think it happens for a lot of people who grow up homosexual, where you're not necessarily sure exactly what the difference is about you, but you know there's something different about your sexuality which can influence your feelings around gender. I think for me, when I started to learn about transition and I started to learn that some people would become another type of person in a way, that started to make me feel like perhaps that was what was wrong with me, so to speak. And I think that really influenced the way I perceived the issues that I was having around my body, because I started to see it as my body is wrong and there might be a solution. I first was just very sure that I didn't want to be a woman. I'd never wanted to be a woman because of the way that I saw women were interacted with in the world, perceived in the world, and that I never had felt akin to them. Many women around me were starting to look and feel very comfortable in their womanhood, and I never had. So for me, it was firstly about removing myself from that feminine identity, as I'd never really felt comfortable with. I think the way my dysphoria manifested was that I didn't want the gender and sexualized parts of my body to exist.
Before gender was a big, huge issue, which it is these days, we used the watchful waiting model. And so we waited and to see what way the child would go with their gender. And nowadays, in the last 10, 12 years, a new kid in town has arrived, which is the gender affirmation model. It has no long-term basis. It has no long-term evidence to support it. It is a theory that if you affirm the child immediately, they will feel better. Now, you could argue, you could use that with childhood. If you affirm everything the child says, in the moment, they will feel better. The long-term impact of that has much more serious consequences.
Some of the children were not receiving that depth of care, that sort of level of assessment, that things were being jumped to a bit too quickly. And this is the problem, you know, something that should be supportive to a child then almost becomes a quick fix. And so if you just agreed with a child and then put them on a medicalised route, there's a real problem with that.
They've adopted a policy which again has no research attached to it. It's based on a sort of ideological belief that in order to reduce the presenting person's feeling of alienation and pain, you have to affirm what they're saying, so that they say that they believe they're born in the wrong body, and you go along with that. Now, I've been in psychiatry for 40 years. That's the only time I've ever been told one has to go along with the patient's beliefs. You're interested and you're empathic, but you don't necessarily just fit in with their beliefs. One finds a position where you think, well, that's interesting. Why do you believe that? Let's try and understand it, and sort of open it out for exploration. You don't just agree with it.
So if a girl presents and says, I'm not a girl, instead of saying, which is what you should say, I understand that's how you feel, I need to understand that, what you mean by that, what that means to you, how you came to that view. In other words, that's called being neutral, which is a clinician's job. What you don't do as a clinician is said, oh, that's very good, you are a boy. That's affirming, and that's a totally inappropriate clinical stance. Where did that come from? It came from a very powerful lobbying organizations such as Mermaids and Stonewall, who had a very strong connection with the Tavistock JIDS service. So for instance, one of the directors of the Tavistock JIDS was also part of an organization called Gendered Intelligence. And Gendered Intelligence is an ideological movement promoting trans identity in adults and children, and promoting the affirmation model. And so what happens when you have the affirmation model? You totally let the child down. Of course, the child may be pleased that you're affirming them and saying, oh yes, but at a deeper level, you're letting that child down.
Certainly, you know, my approach, and I think other people's approach, I don't think I'm alone in this, would be to accept that the child feels that way, and then to be interested to explore with them why they feel that way, and see if we can come to some understanding together in what's going on in their life. And the thing is that there seems to be a view that that's not acceptable, or that that's some kind of conversion therapy.
The first rule of medicine, of therapy, is to do no harm. And actually it feels to me as if the medical profession has been complicit in doing harm to young people. And I found myself thinking from a therapeutic perspective, what on earth are we doing to our children?
So the way we think of it a bit is, you know, if a young person says, for example, you know, I know you think I'm thin because I'm 7 stone or 6 stone, but it's my normal weight, this is the real me. You don't say, oh, that's really good, that's obviously the real you. Nor do you say it isn't. You say, I need to think about that, I need to understand that. So the affirmation model was a terrible failure of a position as a clinician.
I love the ideal of the affirmation model, to support people and believe that people have the best idea about their own identities and what will make them happy. I think it comes from a place of acceptance and kindness, and that's wonderful. But unfortunately, the practicalities aren't always to the benefit of the people who go through that process. So I had the 2 initial appointments to essentially diagnose me with gender dysphoria, which I did receive that diagnosis. After that, I had 1 further appointment after I'd had some blood tests with my GP to check my natural hormone levels. Each appointment I had of my 2 initial appointments with gender specialists did involve quite lengthy questioning, but it didn't feel like questioning to search out whether I really was trans and if this would help me. It felt more like finding out a little bit about me, finding out why I felt this way, and acknowledging my identity as it was at the time. I've had multiple styles of testosterone, from gels to injections, across the 3 years that I was on testosterone for. At the point where it was a year since I had changed my name legally, that was when I was allowed to have a surgical referral for a double mastectomy or top surgery. I essentially had these 2 initial appointments where I received diagnosis, and after that, once I'd had some blood tests done to check my natural hormone levels, I then just had an appointment to confirm that I definitely wanted to go on cross-sex hormones. I felt that by removing the womanhood and the female parts of my identity, I would gain the freedom that I'd felt as a child. I felt that by removing those parts of myself, I could move around the world feeling authentic and feeling free. I wanted to be free from the way that people had been seeing me. I wanted to be free from the way that I felt I was perceived and interacted with. And I wanted to be able to move around the world with confidence again.
I found gender dysphoria in my early 20s when I went on forums, and I told them everything. Like, I had a non-conforming childhood, you know, all the symptoms that they would attribute to gender dysphoria, like low self-esteem, hatred of your body, feeling alien. All these different things came together, and I was like, and I told them on the forum, I was like, I think I might actually have this gender dysphoria thing, and I think I might actually be trans. And they were just like, yeah, you are, you're 100%. Without a shadow of a doubt, you are trans. And you need to act on it now. And if you don't, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. In my head, and especially with the people online who were telling me, you'll regret it in 30 years if you don't do it now, you'll end up looking like me. And these are people who are like 6'2" and they look very masculine, but they're trying to be feminine. And it just lit a fire up in us that if I don't do this now, that I'm not good. So on March 18th, 2014, and March 19th, 2014, I drove to Scotland to get a private assessment. And in those 2 days, I had 3 appointments and left with a full assessment of transsexualism under the DSM-5 it was at the time. And that enabled me to start the HRT on the NHS. And what happened when I actually entered the gender clinic is, and I saw the psychiatrist at the gender clinic in February 2015 for the first time. First question that asked off the bat was, do you want genital reassignment surgery? And I was like, I don't think so. I really don't think so. I'm not sure. So I said to her, I'm not sure, and I would like some time, and I heard that you can get therapy, but I felt that's what I was there for, and that's kind of how they communicated it back to me. This is what we're here for. We're not a mental health service. We're here to help people medically transition. And I believed that it wasn't a mental health service. They wanted me to have surgery more than I wanted to have surgery. It was really bizarre, and I refused it in 2015, I refused it in 2016, and then in 2017, the psychiatrist at the gender clinic said to me, you're established on your hormones, if you don't want surgery, we'll discharge you. But I was in the middle of that critical therapy, and it was the anchor I needed in the world to be well. And then they turned around and said, you're going to get discharged and lose everything if you don't go on this list.
The Gender Identity Development Service at London's Tavistock and Portman Trust is England's only NHS specialist service for young people questioning their gender identity. In June, Newsnight revealed that serious safeguarding concerns had been raised by some staff at GIDS during an official review in 2019. We've now learnt that some of the worries voiced during that review were not new. They go back 15 years.
The Tavistock is the National Health Service's psychotherapy training institution. So it's unlike any other hospital trust in the country. The Tavistock's history, what it's really known for, is thinking about people from a psychological perspective. That's in terms of their developmental psychology, how you develop as a person, the influences of your environment, the influences of your personality. Now, when the Gender Identity Development Service was set up, there was a sort of medical approach to what is basically a psychological problem. So in some ways it was sort of operating outside the usual, what shall I say, history or culture of the service. I'm Marcus Evans, I'm a psychoanalyst. I worked in the NHS for 40 years. Originally I trained as a psychiatric nurse, and then for the last 20 years in the health service I was head of the nursing discipline at the Tavistock Clinic. I then went on to become the governor, which is a voluntary position on the board of governors of the Tavistock Clinic. This is a board that sort of oversees the functioning of the Tavistock, to see whether the Tavistock management are taking things seriously and behaving appropriately, if you like. And the first thing that landed on the desk of the Board of Governors when I joined was a report by David Bell, in which 10 existing members of the Gender Identity Disorder Service had come to him saying they were worried that children were being sort of fast-tracked towards a medical treatment for a psychological problem.
My name is Dr. David Bell. I'm a psychoanalyst, former president of the British Psychoanalytic Society, and I retired in January 2021 after 25 years as a consultant psychiatrist in psychotherapy in the adult department of the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust, commonly known as the Tavistock. I was also a member of the Council of Governors. Working at the Tavistock, I was of course aware of the Gender Identity Service, but really rather distantly aware, because the service was to some extent rather cut off from the ordinary run of the Tavistock Clinic. But I increasingly became aware that children were being seen and diagnosed as being trans children, trans adolescents, and I became very worried about it. It didn't seem to me to accord with my understanding of what the Tavistock did and stood for, particularly with children and adolescents. And it seemed to me to be a very ready submission to an ideology which I thought needed to be questioned and thought about. The concern became, if you like, more real and concretized when I was approached. At that time, I was a member of the Council of Governors, and it was in my second term as a staff representative that I was approached by a staff working on the gender identity services. And first of all, it was only one that approached me. Then one became two, two became four, and four eventually, over a period of about 6 or 7 months, became 10. That was about a third of all the staff working in the London service at the time, and some of them were very senior and some of them were quite junior. So it was and they're also from different disciplines, some medical, some child psychotherapists, some family therapists, some psychologists, and so on. And as I started to listen to what they had to tell me, I became very seriously concerned about the GID service.
This is a very unusual situation, and there was a sort of feeling that the political tail was wagging the clinical dog. So he brought up a lot of concerns on the basis of these 10 members of staff reporting to him that they were worried. The other thing that was presented to the Board of Governors was that 10 parents of kids who had been treated by the service had also written to the Trust Board saying that they were worried that their children had been referred to the service, they had gender dysphoria, they also had all sorts of comorbid problems, and that they were disappointed that there wasn't sufficient psychological evaluation.
The most important thing was that children were being diagnosed as being trans very quickly, without any proper investigation, without taking the kind of lengthy form of detailed understanding that was part of the Tavistock tradition. In other words, being motored through. Technically, it's 4 to 6 appointments over 6 months, but in fact some were being motored through after only 1 or 2 appointments. And I decided that it was my job as a staff governor to bring this great concern about children being mistreated and being inappropriately affirmed without any proper thoughtfulness, and therefore being damaged, placed on a pathway that would lead to puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and potential surgery. I needed to alert the Trust to the danger that these children were being put in, and I need to at least investigate this and think about it. I therefore decided to write a report. I notified the chairman of the board, Paul Burst at the time, and the chief executive, Paul Jenkins, that I was going to write this report, and they said that was okay, until they saw it. When they saw it, they tried to stop me.
Lives are changed at the Tavistock Centre, and what happens here has long drawn attention. Questions about how and whether children should be able to reassign their gender. Children like Kira Bell, who never imagined her story would lead her here.
This was a victory for Kira Bell, who as a teenager was prescribed puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones before deciding she wanted to transition back. A controversial ruling that will make it more difficult for anyone under 16 to get the drugs.
I'm delighted at the judgment of the court today. It was a judgment that will protect vulnerable people. I wish it had been made for me before I embarked on the devastating experiment of puberty blockers.
The judges said in their ruling it was highly unlikely that a child would be competent at the age of 13 to give consent. Age 14 and 15, it is doubtful that a child could understand and weigh the long-term risks and consequences.
I'm Paul Conrath. I'm a lawyer specialising in human rights. I run test cases, often in the courts, challenging the state. I think the law plays a very important part in helping people flourish. And unjust laws or unjust practices and policies actually are very harmful to people. And so my hope has been that by bringing cases against the state, I'd be able to expose practices that are harmful to people and hopefully create a context in which people can flourish, whether children or adults. Our concern very early on in speaking with Marcus and Sue Evans and others who were very frightened, it must be said, but were willing to speak to me nonetheless off the record, was that there was a culture where curiosity was probably more than frowned upon, but people were frightened for their careers. And I think the deeper one delved into this, the more one became concerned that this was an island in medical practice. It simply was way off the beaten track, and potentially huge harm was being done to children. In Kira Bell's case, what became apparent was that from the very first moment she was seen at the Tavistock, she was affirmed in the identity she wanted to be known as a boy and not as a girl, from day one. The issues surrounding why she felt like that, the trauma of her background, were not explored. She was just simply affirmed in that belief, and very soon afterwards then placed onto puberty blockers, and then, as is well known, moved on to cross-sex hormones and a double mastectomy. But it seemed very much to us that this was an affirmative culture that didn't delve into and explore the reasons why she was presenting as a boy. The matter went around the world and became a matter of considerable controversy.
At the time of the landmark court ruling, trans campaigners said it was a devastating blow.
We see day in and day out at Mermaids the positive impacts that hormone blockers can have on young trans people.
I think it's a disaster, quite frankly. I think this is ushering a new era of discrimination against trans people. And I have seen the difference, the positive difference that access to puberty blockers gives to young people, that allows them to get on and live their lives without the torture that is puberty.
The Tavistock Clinic has stopped giving puberty blockers to under 16s, but was this week given leave to appeal the High Court decision.
The Tavistock appealed to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal allowed that appeal.
For Kira Bell, what began as a personal struggle became an 18-month legal battle over whether teenagers who want to change their gender should have access to puberty blockers without their parents' consent. Today, the Court of Appeal said yes, they should. This all began in January 2020 when Kira Bell launched a legal challenge that culminated in a landmark ruling which found that under 16s were unable to decide for themselves whether to take puberty blockers. Today, though, that ruling was overturned.
The Court of Appeal allowed the appeal. They were concerned really that this was a matter of ethical controversy and it was best left to Parliament and to the NHS and to the relevant medical professional bodies to deal with the issue, and that the court was an inappropriate forum to address this matter. I mean, that was a huge disappointment because here we're dealing with vulnerable children, and I think our concern was that this was an abdication of the court's responsibility to protect very vulnerable children.
It was fascinating sitting in court and hearing the defence of the Tavistock's barristers saying that children of 10 could know whether they were born in the right body or not, and that children of 10 could quite reasonably predict that, having been told of what the consequences would be on their bodies and on their fertility, that they could be reasonable enough to weigh up the pros and cons and decide that they wanted to transition. You know, as I'm talking to you about this, I almost get an out-of-body experience myself, because it's so astonishing that in our society we've arrived at a position in which a hospital in the National Health Service in Great Britain in the 21st century could not only be condoning this, but facilitating this. And that according to a rationale which is so extreme and bizarre and couldn't be applied to any other aspect of childhood. So we protect children from all sorts of things. We say that they're not able to have a tattoo, buy alcohol, get married, or whatever. In fact, in my view, we are actually overprotecting our children at the moment. We're very risk averse with children. But in this one instance, our sense, our reasonableness, our understanding of child psychology just disappears. Facilitating a child's discomfort with their own bodies, when what we should be doing as grown-ups is providing an environment in which children are happier with their bodies, not more unhappy with their bodies. We've evacuated common sense, care, concern, and love, actually, from this issue, and we're abandoning children.
What was very unusual in this case, probably more than any case that I've done, was the extraordinary climate of fear around the issue. So I would speak to clinicians in this country who would say to me, I'm very concerned. There are real issues here, but I daren't speak up. My job isn't worth it. And this was a consistent theme. People were frightened. Frightened inside the Tavistock, frightened outside the Tavistock.
One of the things that was very disturbing about this was that all except one of these people refused to see me in my office in the Tavistock. They're frightened of being seen talking to me people might know I'm a governor and might think, what are they talking to him about? Or they might have picked up that I'd expressed some concern about what was going on at GIDS in a rather unformulated way. So they came to this room to talk to me because they're frightened of being seen. All of them had raised problems with their managers, with the Speak Up Guardian, and also at higher levels in the trust, such as the medical director. And all of them felt they'd been completely ignored. And some of them, when they raised concerns about cases, were immediately taken off the case. I can think of one or two gay clinicians who, when they felt that this is a gay person I'm dealing with, they were told they were angry gay people and taken off the case.
People are afraid of not complying because they imagine that the consequences on them will be massive. I assume that everybody transitioning children at the Tavistock must be for the transitioning of children, must believe that there's such a thing as children being born in the wrong body. I discovered from having done the first book that the Tavistock was in total disarray. That clinicians asked to speak to me and my colleague secretly, privately. We went off to a location where nobody would recognize us. We had to promise that we would never name them. So this very disturbing story came out about how they were afraid for their own jobs. Of course, clinicians at the Tavistock are just like everybody else. They have mortgages, they have children, they have their own lives to protect. So now I was introduced to the fact that there were clinicians at the Tavistock who did not want to be doing what they were doing, that children were being really harmed by this, that there was a social contagion, and that kids were, and parents, queuing up to transition their children. How could this possibly be happening in plain sight of everybody, but that this was being seen as a progressive thing to do? The medicine is involved in it, you know, the law has become involved in it, the education system, and so on. How did lobby groups manage to capture our institutions such that professional people are afraid? I think the British public need to be alerted to the seriousness of that.
I've been contacted by teachers, lawyers, therapists, doctors, social workers, all of whom are very worried about the ideology that's taken over their line of work and are far too afraid to speak out about it because they fear the worst, and they fear that people will come for their livelihood, for their reputation. So this ideology seems to have captivated most kind of mainstream professions and vocations, and most worryingly those that deal with children. So people are just too afraid to speak out.
Probably the reason why I'm still speaking about gender is because I have watched so many people being silenced. And anybody who knows anything about history realizes this has happened many, many, many times over, that people have become silenced by a group. And that group became more and more and more powerful, and people became more and more frightened to speak out the truth. And speaking the truth should be our linchpin, it should be our North Star, that if you're speaking the truth, then it's okay. The level of bullying in this debate is formidable and frightening, and that is my experience from all walks of life. Journalists who know what's going on and who don't speak up, teachers who know that children are being harmed, who don't speak up, psychologists, psychotherapists who know that this is very toxic and very bad for children, and they don't speak up because they're afraid.
I began to get concerned at Childline because I was noticing year on year more and more children of younger ages coming through and saying that they felt that they were trapped in their own bodies. So I decided I needed to do some research into this, and I started researching gender dysphoria. I started looking at the statistics and the studies that were there, and I found myself becoming more and more concerned in terms of the practice of almost encouraging children down a potentially irreversible medical pathway. I co-founded the group Thoughtful Therapists with some colleagues who were equally concerned, and we decided that we needed to speak out about these issues within our profession. And so the key step that I took was that I started a government petition, because the government were planning on banning conversion therapy, and there were concerns that I had and colleagues had that this could end up basically having a chilling effect on the therapeutic profession. It could basically force therapists into affirming children towards transitioning. So I started a petition saying to the government, if you ban conversion therapy, please can you safeguard explorative ethical therapy for children? And that was basically the beginning of the end of my studies and new vocation. One day I received an email, a 2-paragraph email, informing me that I've been immediately expelled from my master's degree. I wasn't provided with any evidence, any policies, there was no hearing, there was no appeal. I tried to respond to the email to ask if there had been some mistake, and I discovered that my email address had already been blocked. So within a matter of minutes, I'd been basically excommunicated from my place of study. And then to put the boot in, the same evening, they went to their own Twitter account to publicise my expulsion. Alongside announcing it, they put out a statement of solidarity with the LGBT community, in some way suggesting that I was against that community, and very much it felt trying to ruin my reputation. You know, we do live in an era of cancel culture. I'm just one victim of this. There's a lot of people out there who have had it far worse than I have. And unfortunately, I think before the tide truly turns, there's going to be many more people who suffer by speaking out. But I was doing this because I was deeply concerned about the welfare and well-being of children. You know, I always try and tell people that they need to have faith and they need to stand up for what is right, because until they do, unfortunately, nothing is going to change in our society.
Really extreme things have happened to me which are difficult to relay to people. Medical students refused to be taught by me. These were people who are going to become doctors themselves. When I was invited to the University of Bristol, I had to have security. I mean, it is most bizarre to be giving a lecture and to have the security follow me around. I've had students invading my lecture theatre, standing on taking over, standing on the desks to prevent me from teaching. I have had trans activists, you know, really threatening me physically, in terms of preventing me from entering buildings, nearly pushing me down the stairs as I'm trying to enter it. I've had the police outside doing nothing about it. And I've had a range of different experiences like this. But these experiences in themselves have led to something else, which has been more traumatic for me, if you want to put it that way, in that I realised that our liberal democratic institutions are falling. And that's been very, very frightening and very disorientating. Because without realising it, I think we're privileged in our Western countries, and we imagine that we have free speech, we imagine that our institutions are there, that justice will prevail. And to have the living proof that something very serious is going on in our institutions has been the most destabilizing thing for me, actually. And it's taken quite a lot of coming to terms with this. Alongside that is that people don't really believe that it can be as bad as this. It is as bad as this.
I think so much of it is because of what children are being taught and being exposed to, including in schools. You know, I've really immersed myself in primary school, secondary school teaching materials that are being provided by charitable organisations, they would call themselves. And some of what our kids are being taught these days are absolutely horrifying. I've come across primary school kind of comic colouring books for children which state the doctor made a guess at your sex when you were born, he might have got it wrong. That's word for word what it says. What type of question mark does that put into a young, impressionable, vulnerable child's mind? It immediately gets them thinking, well, could the doctor have got it wrong with me? Is there something wrong with me? Am I a different sex? How would I know if I was a different sex? I've equally come across very regressive, stereotypical type materials, including that which has suggested to young boys that if they like the colour pink or they like flowers, that they might actually be trapped in the wrong body. So if that's the basis for being transgender, then it's no surprise that we have a significant increase in young people saying that they feel as if they are trapped in the wrong bodies.
Children, in my view, and teenagers who are medically transitioned are the collateral damage of an adult ideology.
The process of genital surgery is extremely brutalistic. The first thing they do is they give you what's called an orchidectomy, which is they remove the testicles. Once they do that, they then essentially shave the skin off the penis for that to be reused. And then they start removing the penile tissue, the erectile tissue. Everyone, no matter who, will always have a little bit of erectile tissue there. So if you imagine your knuckle losing your finger from that point, you've still got the knuckle, you can still twinge it. So unfortunately, you still have that phantom sensation. And in doing so, what they also do is they move and re-angle the urethra, which causes a very common complication, which is a complication I have, which is urethral constriction, which is where you can't pass urine properly. It'll either come up slowly, painfully, or in some cases not at all. Some people have got catheters for the rest of their lives. Some people have got really horrific complications. And for me, I lost a lot of blood in surgery because they drill right through your pelvis. The infections that you get after are just just a normal thing. You just get infections. You can get people who have necrosized flesh, so that's flesh dying inside or rejecting. You've got the risk of prolapse, and you've also got the mental stuff, which no one wants to talk about. The mental stuff after surgery, even if you want it, even if you're happy with it, is tough. You lose energy, you become extremely fatigued and vulnerable in a way, because you recognize you don't have that power in a sense. It's a very strange feeling, but yeah, it's quite brutal.
I had an appointment to discuss the surgical referral and to officially have that referral made. I then had an appointment a few months later with the surgeon to discuss what the procedure would look like and what the outcomes would be. It wasn't a very long appointment. It definitely didn't go into any sort of therapeutic questions about why I wanted it. I think the surgeon could see that I had a trans identity and I'd been on hormones for 6 months at that point. So I think as far as he was concerned, I was going there to have this surgery, and it affirmed the identity I had at the time. It took me until I was almost 3 years on testosterone to start to really question what I was doing, and it didn't stem from a questioning of my identity at the time. What happened to me was I started to experience a phenomena that does happen to a lot of people who have a transition that's transmasculine, where the testosterone therapy causes issues for their internal bodily functions from a female lens. So my female reproductive organs started to have some issues. I hadn't had any menstrual experiences since the onset of testosterone. And at the point where I got to about 2.5 years on testosterone, I started to experience a lot of severe pain in my genital region.
I can't remember the exact day after surgery it was when I was coming to, but it was the moment where I'd got out of bed, the bandaging around had been gone, so it must have been about day 4 or 5, and it was the first time I stood in front of a full-length mirror and I just saw what it just looked like I'd been attacked, you know? It's really brutal. It felt crushing. It felt like I'd betrayed myself in the worst possible way, because that was it, you know.
So at this point, I'd been living for 3 years as a man, and I'd gotten to the point where I was never misgendered in that identity. I was always seen as male, and in my workplace, the predominant part of my work colleagues, they didn't know that I was trans. It was very validating to have gotten to that point where I was seen fully in the world as a man, and that had seemed to be the goal for me since identifying as such. But when I started to experience these physical symptoms which caused me to reflect on what I was doing to myself, I started to realize how different I still felt. Despite having gone through this process, I felt very different to the people around me, and I felt very different from men, even though there were parts of my personality that reflected a lot of men and masculine personality traits we assign to men. It certainly didn't make me feel comfortable in social settings with men, and I often felt like I was an imposter amongst them. In some ways was feeling a lot less close to this identity than I had at the beginning, and I was now being perceived by the world as a man, and I felt like an imposter. That for me was a red flag, and it made me think that perhaps what I had chosen to do in terms of identifying as a man to avoid the confusion of the world around me had been a mistake. So I was experiencing this really intense pain in my genital region, and I wasn't sure why that was, but I did some research and I realized that that was almost certainly to do with the testosterone. It turns out that my internal female reproductive organs were starting to atrophy, which unfortunately is something that happens in a transmasculine transition where testosterone is used. I think what happened for me was the physical symptoms brought to light the issue that I was facing, that I'd been on these treatments for years without question, and I wasn't fully aware of some of the negative effects. I don't think that that's necessarily something that wasn't said to me at any point, but it certainly wasn't something that I'd retained, perhaps through the excitement of the whole procedure. Seeing the way that this was affecting my body in a very negative way and reading about what would happen, the fact that I would be forced to have a hysterectomy if I continued on testosterone simply for safety reasons and increased risk of cancer, I knew that I was taking some very serious steps, and at that point I had to question it. So I started by coming off the testosterone. I had spoken to my gender specialist, now with the NHS, and they were sceptical about me coming off testosterone. The typical route for a trans man is to continue on hormone therapy for life and have a hysterectomy to deal with the issue. I didn't want a hysterectomy, so I took myself off hormones because I felt that I wasn't being listened to in the fact that I didn't want to be on it anymore.
I went back to therapy because I was recovering and I was still enrolled at therapy at the gender clinic, and I said, I think I fucked up here, I think I've made a really bad decision. And their response was, you've just had this major surgery, it's well known that anaesthetic lowers serotonin levels. Like, yeah, this is a rumination, this is just the OCD. So I would go back every month and like every session and say, I feel the same. This is fucking mental. I should have never have done this.
One of the big news stories overnight, the NHS to close the UK's only dedicated gender identity clinic for children and young people.
Now, the Tavistock Gender Clinic will be closed down after a review found it was not safe for children.
Tavistock, which is the National Health Service, the NHS-run gender clinic, which has been offering sex change surgery to children, it's going to have to shut its doors.
This review said that the current model of care was leaving young people at considerable risk of poor mental health and distress, and having one clinic was not a safe or viable long-term option.
There is some nervousness as the NHS looks to open 8 new regional clinics. The London-based service will be led by Great Ormond Street Hospital, with a greater focus on other medical needs during the process.
So So my feelings about the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service closing are mixed, of course, because I'm aware there are children and their families waiting for treatment. But I am very pleased that Dr. Hilary Cass and NHS England have looked more closely at the concerns raised by clinicians and parents and ex-patients, because the NHS should be there to provide good ethical care with an evidence base where possible, and I think that this has really been a service that has lost its way.
I'm optimistic that the holistic model will help a lot of children, because I don't think that Tavistock has been helping children. It feels to me it's been a catastrophe, the Tavistock. And I want to know whose idea this was.
So I do have a concern what happens if the services just multiply elsewhere. I think with new services developing, what I would be hopeful of is that in the future we are allowed to discuss this area, we are allowed to research it much more thoroughly, we are allowed to raise concerns around clinical models, and that in a sense a holistic service will develop.
My understanding of the Tavistock closure and how the regional model will be impacted is that it's not to replicate the practices from Tavistock, because in the report on the closure it had some damning statements attached to it. It had failed children. I don't understand why you would want to roll that out nationally if that's what you're admitting. You're saying we're going to close you down, but we're going to roll it out because it worked so badly.
The health watchdog rated this centre inadequate earlier this year after they found that some children were waiting up to 2 years for an appointment. What this expansion shows is that demand is growing exponentially, and the NHS is being forced to keep up.
I think the Tavistock very badly lost its way, and it fell into a groupthink. And they all presumed, even though they were biting their lip and realising this isn't going well, there was so many psychologists saying something isn't appropriate about the treatment we're giving these children. I've since met many of those doctors and psychologists that work there, and they've said things like, I transed hundreds of kids and I don't think any of them should have been transed. My hope is that we will lose our fear of speaking the truth, and that people will start to realise, no, so long as you're speaking the truth in a compassionate way, that's good enough. And that actually people with real deep distress will get serious help, and that everybody else will be able to speak freely, because we know that we have thought about it in a very deep way. We've looked at the stats, we've looked at the research, we know, we've learned from the detransitioners, and we know the truth is going to come out.
I think I regret the speed at which I approached transition, especially the medical side. I don't think seeking diagnosis was necessarily an issue, and I did experience gender dysphoria, which I was diagnosed with. But the rush to have surgical intervention and to have hormones was definitely something that I wish I had taken more time over. I wish I'd explored in therapy the feelings I was having, so that even if I did take those medical steps, I'd at least laid some groundwork to know that I might not regret them and I might feel more confident, rather than rushing in as if it would solve all of my problems. I think the most important thing that we can do for our children and for anyone struggling with gender identities that don't align with the typical narrative of what is male and what is female is to embrace all forms of that, to not say prescriptively this is a woman and this is a man, but you can dress, look, speak, play with toys of any kind. You don't need to perform masculinity or femininity to be valid in that. I think we need to strip these ideas about what a man or woman should be so that children can just be.
There are all sorts of issues that children are growing up with now that they've never faced before. And I think there will be a huge fallout in terms of mental health and psychological damage. And I think this is a massive social experiment on this generation of children.
I transitioned because it did feel like a golden ticket out of my issues, and I detransitioned because I realised that that ticket is invalid, can't be used.
There are permanent effects. I have facial and body hair. Female hormones don't remove the hair that we've grown on testosterone. I also have genital changes which are permanent. And of course, I had a double mastectomy. Now that was the thing that was causing the predominant bulk of my dysphoria in the beginning, and I do still have mixed feelings on my flat chest whether or not I in some ways still appreciate the neutrality it gives me and the fact that I do feel like I'm less sexualized by trying to avoid what was difficult by going through the surgery. In some ways I've stripped myself of the opportunity to embrace my womanhood fully.
Queuing up to transition in plain sight of everybody, but that this was being seen as...
This is not reversible. The experiment is over for me. There really, really isn't any turning back.